Greetings and welcome to our session on current trends and possible futures in student transitions and mobility. I'm Robert Adamowski. I'm Director of Research and Admissions at BC-CAT. And joining us today are two of my colleagues, Anna Takina, BC-CAT's Research Officer, and Joanne Heslop, Manager of Student Transitions. Today, we'd like to share with you some of the rich data we have on student pathways. We've got several decades worth of data on how students transition from the K-12 system into post-secondary in BC and the pathways that they follow as they complete their programs and move on to their careers or to further studies. We'd like to use this data to springboard into a discussion that I think a lot of us are thinking about these days on how the COVID-19 pandemic might impact the patterns we've documented with our research. Will a move away from campus-centered learning and towards online learning impact whether and when students begin their post-secondary studies? Will the pandemic impact subgroups of students differently? Will the new emphasis on online learning impact how students take advantage of BC's transfer system? Our discussion today is divided into two main sections. We're going to first discuss patterns of student transition from the K-12 system and enrollment and persistence in post-secondary studies. And then later, we'll look specifically at student mobility patterns within the post-secondary system in BC. In each of these sections, we encourage you to think about how the COVID-19 pandemic and the various changes it brings to post-secondary might impact the patterns we describe. As you have questions or ideas, please add them to the question and answer section. And at the end of each section, we'll have a short virtual discussion about how COVID-19 might impact the patterns we've described based on your ideas and questions. And now I'll pass things over to Joanne Heslop to get us started.
So many of you know, as if you're familiar with the STP, that we are able to identify the high school graduates in BC who transition to BC public post-secondary education. Now, typically we look separately at those who enroll immediately or those who enroll within 1 year of high school graduation. Those are the immediate entry students. And we look at them separately from those who delay their entry by 1 or more years after graduation. So let's begin with the immediate entry students. And here we see that the immediate entry rate has declined from a peak of 53.9% in 2008-09 to 51.6% more recently. The delayed entry transition rate for those who waited 1, 2, or 3 years before enrolling has declined from its peak of 19.2% in 2001-02 to 16% more recently. And if we sum these two lines, we see that about 68 to 70% of BC high school completers transition to post-secondary in BC within 4 years of high school graduation. If we compare these steady and consistent declining trends, we see that proportionately, the delayed transition, this orange line at the bottom, has declined about 17% compared to the blue line, the immediate entry transition rate has declined about 4%. And so for context, we should also note that 2008-09 was a year with significant economic downturn. And we know that the post-secondary participation is typically countercyclical to economic indicators. So later in the discussion, we'd like you to think about how these trends will move over the next 3 years or so, given the impact of the pandemic. Now let's look at the interesting differences between students who transition immediately and those who delay their transition. And we see that the transition into different sectors is related perhaps to academic qualifications, but let's have a look at the data. This is based on 5-year averages, and we can see on the left, I'll be presenting the immediate entry students and where they enroll, and on the right, we'll look at the delayed entry students. 40% of immediate transitioners enter research-intensive universities, while 45% of delayed transitioners enter the college sector. And on the left, the balance of the immediate entry students enroll in TIUs, colleges, and institutes. When we compare to the 40% RIU students, immediate entry, we can see that a smaller share, 17%, enter the RIUs as delayed entry students. And the balance of the delayed entry students enroll in TIUs and institutes. And remember that transition rates have been falling over the last decade, And in particular, delayed transition rates are dropping. So do you think that the impact of the pandemic might affect the post-secondary institution sectors differently based on the typical transition patterns of students? So something to think about for later. Now, not all of BC high school completers transition to BC public post-secondaries. Some choose to attend post-secondary in other provinces or other countries, and others attend private post-secondaries. So this next bar graph will combine the immediate and delayed transitioners to show the effect of high school GPA on post-secondary destinations, being BC public, BC private, or non-BC institutions. So here we see the transition rates into BC public institutions, with lower transition rates among students with lower high school GPAs, shown on the horizontal axis here, and increasingly higher transition rates amongst those with higher GPAs. And we'll see in a moment why the transition rates seem to be kind of dropping here for those students with higher GPAs. But first, let's look at the red sections of the bars. These are the students who entered BC private institutions. And we can see that students who entered BC privates tend to have the lower GPAs, and they're more likely to transition to post-secondaries in the BC private system than those with the higher GPAs. Now we'll look at the transition rates of the students who transition to out-of-province institutions in the green sections of the bars. Here we can see that students with higher GPAs are more likely to transition out of province than students with lower GPAs. So these green bars here, you can see how that makes up for that dip that we saw in the blue bars here. So we have more students with high GPAs going out of province. And if we look at the total height of these bars, 88%, 92%, 94%, these are the overall transition rates into all sectors for those highest achievers. So do you think the pandemic and the move from on-campus learning to online learning might impact whether students choose to leave BC for post-secondary or to attend a private post-secondary? We'll talk about that later. So now let's just step back from the transition patterns and look at the overall post-secondary enrollment trends in BC public post-secondaries. So we can see that the total headcount enrollment in BC public post-secondaries at about 450,000 students is up about 3% over the last decade. And we can see that the headcount enrollment numbers for domestic students are down about 9% over the decade. And this is consistent with the observation that BC high school students seem to be transitioning at a somewhat lower rate. And the overall growth in enrollments has come about because of the dramatic increase in international student enrollments, which are up about 180% over the decade. So, given the increased number of international students in the BC public post-secondary system, how do you think the pandemic will impact enrollment? So in the final slide for this section, we'll look at one key factor that ties together transition rates and enrollment, that is persistence. This is the number of students enrolled in the post-secondary system as a function of the number that enter, the length of their program, and the degree to which they persist to completion. Those are all factors that impact student persistence. So let's consider how the pandemic might impact persistence. What proportion of students who enrolled in the spring of any particular spring year would then continue on into the following fall? And here you can see the trend line for domestic students, and it shows the persistence of these students over a 15-year period. When we also account for the fact that students who might leave an institution could enroll in a different institution in the system, we see that represented in the dotted line here. And we can also see the persistence rate of international students on the right. They have a higher persistence rate. And similarly, you can see that they also tend to move to other institutions if they do not persist at their own institution, although at a slightly lower rate. So how might the pandemic affect student persistence? Something to think about in our discussion. So now we'll move to that opportunity for some discussion.
All right, welcome back. So we are now into the first question and answer session for this presentation. I just want to highlight and draw your attention to the bottom of the session description. That's where we have a number of handouts. We have the BC Transfer Students profile highlights, as well as STP research results from 2020 and student mobility highlights from 2019. So these are great reference resources to take a look at with regards to student mobility. So I've got a few opening questions, and please feel free to put your questions into the question and answer or the chat. So my first question is, we saw that there has been a consistent decline in both immediate and delayed transitions since the last peak in 2008, which was our last significant economic downturn. Should we expect transition of BC graduates to continue to decline, or will the state of the economy make post-secondary more attractive? How about I pass that one over to you, Rob?
Great, thanks, Mike. Maybe I'll start off by just referencing the two polls that we've got up right now. One of those polls asks the question, how do you think the pandemic will impact the patterns of BC high school students transitioning into post-secondary? And the responses to that poll seems to be a large number of folks who think that there'll be a slowing of the transition rate over the next few years. Some of the comments that there will be more gap years, that I believe more of them will need to enter the workforce rather than post-secondary, that they'll stay local, hopefully. Also someone who said they may not go locally. So diverse set of responses, but the majority of people seeing some downtick in terms of transition. Some people anticipating more transition, more entering, but lower GPAs perhaps. And a couple fascinating responses, things like a K recovery. The well-off will be unaffected and do better in the long term. Poor will be delayed. So interesting responses, I think, give us a range of possible outcomes here.
All right. Well, we saw that students with lower high school GPAs tend to transition into the college and institute sector or to the BC private institutions, sometimes after a delay of 1 or more years. Students with higher GPAs tend to transition directly to BC universities or to other post-secondaries outside of the province. Do you think the universities and colleges might be differentially impacted by the pandemic, given their typical student cohort? How about you? What do you think, Joanne?
Oh, I knew you'd throw me that one. We were just talking before we went live here, and I said, I really want to have the data. I don't really want to speculate on what's going to happen, but I'm really anxious to get some data, and I'm going to analyze this, and I'll tell you all the facts. No fake news once we have the data.
No fake news, all right.
Maybe I'll jump in a little bit on that one. I think the important point to understand here is that we do have a system in BC with our post-secondary institutions, right? And we see that during normal times, with some students choosing the environment at colleges and some choosing the environment at universities, slightly different demographics for those groups of students. And of course, the transfer system creates a lot of options for students wherever they decide to start. So I think it's important to think about things systemically, right? If we see increasing capacity in some sectors, that may draw students from other sectors. And similarly, we may have students who don't particularly respond well to the environment that they find at the institution where they start. And we've shown that the transfer system can be a lot of help for those students who may need to sort of recalibrate, change their course in the midst of their studies.
Okay, we got a couple of questions. Oh, so go ahead, Joanne.
No, that was me. May I just jump in? I don't have the data, as Joanne said, but I have an opinion. I think the trend where students go into colleges or institutes or universities will largely remain the same, based on their GPA, possibly access to some of the institutions. However, again, I think Joanne will tell us more when she gets the data.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, from Anne Summerfield. She comments that it's interesting that about the data about the higher GPAs going out of the province, and the question is do you think that that's related to scholarship dollars?
I can answer this one, maybe. I don't know for sure, but certainly the way we can determine whether or not students went out of province was from a couple of data sources. And one was student financial aid data, and the other was some scholarship data, the Passport to Education data set, which is kind of coming to its end. So it could be that there are a larger proportion of students that are seen in that data set for the Passport to Education, the scholarship type of data. So maybe that's what's kind of skewing the results, and they do appear to be going out of province.
All right. Another question from the audience. This is from Jillian Feist from Education Planner BC. When do you expect to receive data on registrations for fall 2020 so that we can see the impact of COVID-19?
I guess I can answer that one too. We're just in the midst of collecting data. I actually just received data from SFU today. Haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But every fall we do receive the data from all of the post-secondary institutions, and then I have to do a lot of data cleaning. And so by the time it's cleaned and submitted to the Ministry of Education to get merged with K-12 data, I don't get it back until January, February, maybe March. So, you know, by the time we get some results out, it could be middle of spring, kind of February, March. So be waiting for that.
All right. Well, I think we will be looking forward to seeing the impact of COVID-19 on a variety of different areas in higher education. I got another question for you. How do you think the move from primarily on campus to significantly online delivery will impact student persistence? Given what you've seen in the data, do you expect that the transfer system will help students persist as we move through the pandemic? I'll throw that over to you, Rob.
Great. It'll be interesting to see. And again, we see some of this reflected in the responses to the poll. We had a number of people suggest that although there was a lot of shock and adaptation that had to happen when students moved online, both whether they were in secondary school or whether they were in post-secondary, that they are adapting, and that faculty are also adapting to delivering courses in that kind of a modality. And I think that longer term analysis might be interesting, right? To see whether online learning may not be as negative over the long term, and students and faculty may become more adapted to that kind of model, in which case we would perhaps see at least a leveling of persistence, if not actually maybe an improved persistence over time.
All right. Well, we don't have any more questions in the chat, but what we are going to do is now turn over to the second part of this presentation. And then please keep putting stuff into the chat because we will be coming back to a live Q&A at the end of the second part of this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. We are moving to the second part of our discussion, which is focused on student mobility patterns. And since we are at BC-CAT, we are particularly interested in how student mobility might be impacted by the pandemic, or indeed, how we may help to support students as they continue their learning during this period. First of all, I'm going to discuss some student mobility trends. And the past data shows us that a large number of students, over 55,000 annually, move between post-secondary institutions in BC. Although this number has been fairly consistent over the last 5 years, the mobility rate has been steadily decreasing as the total number of enrolled students in BC has grown. This consistent drop in mobility rate may be partially explained by the growing number of options for students to complete baccalaureate degree studies in BC since 2008. Here a question arises: how does this rich program environment, with so many options for students, impact how students respond to the changes related to COVID-19? And we can discuss this later. But let me start with the most traditional transfer pathway, the one that actually drove the initial development of the BC transfer system, These are students who transfer up to 2 years worth of credits to a research university to complete a baccalaureate degree. This group of the so-called traditional transfer students makes up about 10% of all mobile students in BC. They also make up about 36% of annual enrollment at research universities. So these students are quite important to these institutions. The following graphs show the sector of the sending institutions. Overall, the number of transfer students has been steady over the decade. It's about 5,500 students per year. And over the last decade, colleges have consistently provided the largest number, about a half, of transfer students to research universities. And over the decade, colleges have remained consistent in the number of transfer students they prepare. The next largest groups of students here are transfer students from TIUs and private institutions. The biggest changes have been the significant decrease in students from teaching universities and a significant increase in the number of transfer students from private institutions. And we know that pathways from private institutions to research universities are very popular for international students. And the last one is the movement from research universities to research universities themselves. One possible reason for these dynamics, this is a decrease in TIUs and increase in private institutions, may be the increased number of baccalaureate programs at TIUs. So students do not need to transfer from these sector institutions to complete a bachelor's degree at a research university. And transfer students from private institutions are filling the gap. And here's the question for you. How might the number of students from colleges and from private institutions change, given the immigration policy changes arising from COVID-19? Will students continue to show a willingness to complete at a non-research university, given the decreased role of on-campus learning during this period? Student demographics provide an interesting window into the potential impact of COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 has had a varied economic impact, with women and young people shouldering more of the damage. The bar graph on the left, this is the blue graph, the blue bars, shows the demographic characteristics of all undergraduate population in BC public post-secondary institutions. And the graph on the right, the green bars, shows demographics of the traditional transfer students moving to research universities. Transfer students are more likely to be enrolled in arts and sciences. Well over 50% of transfer students are pursuing those programs post-transfer. Arts courses are among the most likely programs to be delivered entirely online during the pandemic. This means that these transfer students are particularly impacted by the dynamics of this mode of delivery. Will these students persist across several semesters of online delivery? Will they maintain full-time studies? How will online learning shape the decision-making of our students in terms of the institution that they decide to attend? The next factor is the gender. Not surprisingly, there are more students who identify as female at BC public post-secondary institutions, more than those identifying as male. And this difference is even greater among transfer students. How might the economic effect of COVID-19 impact this group of students? Will further education be attractive in a period of reduced job opportunities? Or will the pressures of the unpaid work reduce female students' capacity for full-time studies, especially if the studies happen primarily at home? International students are overrepresented among transfer students. how will this population of students be impacted by the changes brought by COVID-19? And finally, transfer students tend to be a bit younger than the overall undergraduate student population. This is the tail of the older age group is smaller for transfer students than for all undergraduate students. Can we foresee any differential impacts for younger students from COVID-19? And here I will pass it back to Joanne. Joanne.
So finally, let's look at one particular variety of student mobility called co-enrollment. Co-enrolled students are enrolled at more than one institution simultaneously. Now, you may find it surprising to know that co-enrollment is not that common in BC. It only makes up about 2% of enrolled students in any given fall term. In other words, the vast majority of students are enrolled in just one institution. Now, the trend in co-enrolled students has fluctuated between 2.1% to 2.4%, and in general, it has been declining. So something to think about, will we see this proportion of co-enrolled students grow as students are limited primarily to online learning? And one other little piece of information to support this is, where do these students co-enroll? Between what two institution types do we see the most common co-enrollment? What we do see is that co-enrolled students tend to attend teaching universities while attending a research university, or attend a teaching university while also attending a college. And you can see those numbers here. So the other question is, will we see teaching universities continue in this role through the COVID-19 period? And that concludes the second part of our presentation, and another opportunity for further discussion.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're now into the second portion of our question and answer. So as always, put your questions into the chat and the Q&A because this is your opportunity to get real-time answers from our experts. So I want to go circle back to a question that was submitted in the previous session, but we didn't get to it. This is from Jennifer Lyle. Do you think that the move to online learning will result in more students opting to attend part-time rather than full-time? And there was one comment in the chat from Ann Summerfield, who observed that that's what they are seeing right now at the institution that she is at. So what do you think?
Well, that's a great question. And of course, we're to some extent speculating, although institutions will have a little bit of an indication. What we know from, for example, studies of transfer students is that a lot of transfer students do actually take lesser course loads than students who are not moving between institutions. And for some students, that's because they have competing demands, family, work, etc. So I guess the question is really about how online learning integrates with those things. And I think just off the top of my head, it seems like it integrates better with some than others, right? If you've got lots of family obligations, it may make it quite difficult to study at home right now. I'm sure a lot of people are experiencing that. If your demands are sort of more time limited, like a shift at work, then it may be easier for students. It'll be interesting to see how many move to part-time.
Yeah, it will be, and hopefully we'll be able to get some data points on that to analyze that in the future. You know, with regards to the impact of the pandemic, what kind of impact do you think it will the pandemic impact subgroups of students differently? Looking at the different demographics of students, what do you think, Anna?
As I mentioned in the presentation, I think the transfer students are a little bit different than the general undergraduate population, and I think those groups that are highlighted there will definitely be impacted. I think for female students that will be more difficult, balancing the especially for more mature students, balancing the house, the kids, if needed, with the studies, and same with the, for example, art students. that may not persist as long, or may switch to institutions that offer more face-to-face options, or on the other hand, it's all uncertain at this stage, or they can stick to home and do not transfer as much.
All right. With the new emphasis on online, do you feel that the emphasis on online learning will impact how students take advantage of the BC transfer system?
Well, we asked a similar question in the poll, and many of you contributed. I think overall, the responses that we saw were that people anticipate increased mobility for students, mostly because they're going to have more access to more course offerings online. And there were a lot of you making reference to co-enrollment, students perhaps cobbling programs together based on courses from a number of institutions. We actually got very few responses indicating that mobility might be negatively impacted. Most people felt it was going to be increased. And I just wanted to point out maybe a couple of the more sort of interesting, fascinating answers that we got. One person suggested that more initial applications to their first choice institution might lead to less transfer. That is, as there may be more capacity at institutions and students may not need to enter a first institution before transferring to a second. Another respondent suggested that there would be more requests for letters of permission. So if you're at an institution that requires letters of permission, that's something to think about. That would definitely be, I think, a workload issue if we had a number of students trying to pick up courses at different institutions.
I may jump in here. There has been some research, it is US based though, not yet Canadian, that shows that the transfer has been overall decreasing during the COVID and post quarantine measures. However, the rate of transfer into the large research universities has increased, which may imply that it's the bigger institutions are making it easier for transfer students to get in, and that may affect their enrollment of transfer students, but also it may affect the enrollment of students in colleges, in the smaller institutions, which may see a decline in the number of students they get in and they get as transfer as well.
All right. Another question from the audience from our good friend Margaret Heldman from Langara College. This is a question, I believe, for you, Joanne. Are co-enrolled students studying similar subjects or are they in similar programs?
Well, we certainly have the data to be able to drill down to the program level to find out what students are doing when they do co-enroll. And there seems to be data all over the map. Some students are in the same program, arts and sciences at one institution, arts and sciences at the other. But if you go down to a much more granular level, sometimes you're taking something completely different at a different institution. So that's looking at data that we've had for many years. Now, of course, in this COVID world, we might see something completely different.
All right. Another question from the audience. This is from Paula Weaver from Schofield College. Do teaching universities offer more micro-credential opportunities than research universities? If yes, post-COVID choices may lean to the more practical teaching university choices, especially if the micro-credential transfers to traditional academic credentials. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have some thoughts on that. Yes. From the work that Joanne Douglas did on micro-credentials, we saw that we discovered that 5 teaching institutions, teaching universities in BC are offering micro-credentials, and that may drive students towards these kind of institutions, especially if those type of credentials will help them in the workforce, or maybe they can, get those and work and study somewhere else as well, given that the system allows for more mobility given the online environment, and also more options for co-enrollment given the online environment.
All right. Anybody else have any other thoughts about micro-credential opportunities and the impact it might have on transfer?
It's very early days in terms of the micro-credentials specifically, but I think there's an interesting point in there as well about sort of applied studies and those with a more direct pathway to employment. And I think that may become a differentiator for some programs, those that can have a shorter time horizon to getting into the world of work. That may be a differentiator. I noticed that in our poll, there was another differentiator that emerged, which is face-to-face learning. Now, those institutions who were able to go back to face-to-face learning more quickly might be attractive to some students who aren't doing as well with online learning. So there's a couple of differentiators there that may become more important over time as we move through the pandemic.
All right. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I think what we will do is give everybody back the gift of time. And so just a reminder that the next session will be our last session, which will start at 2 o'clock. This is our panel on CAT-CAN and what's going on across the country. You'll want to check in for that. That'll be led by Rob Fleming. And then, of course, at 2:45, we will have our wrap up for the day. That's when we'll be announcing the contest winners. So you'll want to make sure you tune in for that as well. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you at 2 o'clock.